I mean, I can say a couple things to that. I think, you know, when we get to a question about what's the influence of an American institution in the 20th century on that of other countries, we need to be particularly careful of sort of defining our terms. In the United States as an influential nation state in the world in the 20th century economically and things like that. So what I did is, for the most part, tended to focus on diffusion of protocols, concepts from the FDA to other foreign regulators and sometimes through the World Health Organization. So just to give you an example, India, sort of, you know, formally, excuse me, the world's largest democracy, has, in addition to a huge allopathic medical system, a very large set of traditional healing systems, Ayurvedic, Unani, Siddha, and so forth. And so what first piqued some of my interest was just going through regulations that had been passed there in 1945 and then I think revisited in 1948. And then later, well, bottom line is they adopted what in the FDA in the 1950s were called good manufacturing practices, which were applied to pharmaceutical firms, which this is probably a perfect example of a case in which an FDA regulation has helped to solidify and stabilize the reputation of the American pharmaceutical industry, the global pharmaceutical industry. India, in its attempt to sort of modernize its traditional healing medicines industry, took a large number of those concepts, you know, appropriated them, didn't just take them whole stock, and applied them to manufacturers of Ayurvedic medicines. And there's even now a new Ayurvedic drug approval process in India, although it's somewhat convoluted. If you're already listed in the main pharmacopoeia of Ayurvedic medicines in India, you're kind of already in the door. But if you're testing something new or making a new therapeutic claim, you've got to go through a system of clinical trials, which has been highly politicized because there's all these traditional practitioners. But there's an example where I doubt anybody in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s FDA, when they were thinking about how to design a partitioned experiment, or when they were thinking about good manufacturing practices, had Ayurvedic medicines in 20th century India in mind. And yet, there's probably been, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who've been deeply influenced by those concepts because they've diffused and they've been adopted in some respects because they're seen as legitimate. The only other thing I would say is, you know, to the extent I talk in the last chapter about the decline in the FDA's reputation, there has been, and you know, I don't know how to quantify it or put a number on it or anything like that. And I think a lot of it, I think, as Josh says, there's somewhat of a sort of a comeback going on. But one thing that struck me was a conversation I had with a Brazilian pharmaceutical regulator about 6 years ago from this agency they have newly established called ANVISA, A-N-V-I-S-A is the acronym. And what he said is, and I think this doesn't gesture as much purely to the decline in the FDA's reputation as it gestures just simply to a more globalized world. So he said a lot of Latin American regulators in his conversations were taking their cues just as much, if not more, from the EMA, which is the London-based European Medicines Agency, as from the FDA. And so it's, you know, I think for most of the 20th century, it is predominantly an American story. But I think over the last 10 to 15 years, it's become increasingly an American and European story. And perhaps even without, you know, some of the FDA's mishaps in the 1990s and in the Bush administration, things like that, that would have been true. Because the European countries have been investing a lot in their pharmaceutical facilities, not just private, but also public universities and so forth, and in the EMA.
I'd like to actually ask each of you the following question. A lot of developments about FDA at present and going forward kind of feel like a playing backward of the movie of the progressive era that gave rise to FDA in the first place. That is the shared belief that it's a good idea for the government to seems to be the battering ram with which that notion is being attacked. There's a lot of argument now about how really the government, the faceless government bureaucrats, one of whom is with us today, should not be allowed to get between doctors and patients, and that companies have a, if not God-given, at least constitutionally given right to communicate truth as they see it by virtue of the First Amendment to whomever they want about their drugs. And what can we learn from the history of the evolution of the FDA to where it is today about how it will meet what I see as perhaps one of the most important threats to its, not just legitimacy, but its very existence, which is the government shouldn't have a right to tell people what drugs they want to use, and any maker of a drug ought to be able to present its data to doctors and patients so that they can make up their own minds without having Josh tell them what to do. Where do you all see that going, informed by the history of how we've gotten to where we are now? Charles?
Well, I don't temperamentally like to feel like an optimist. Maybe I'm just a defender of inertia. But I think if you look at all the stakeholders and balance out their stakes, there will be a lot of people have a stake in this function being performed, as I was trying to imply, and that Big Pharma ultimately has a stake in the FDA, a complicated stake, and I think many other people do too, or enough of them do, that it will maintain its, maybe not the same, but it will maintain that kind of role. And when you buy a drug, it has a lot of components in it. One of the components is a kind of faith that there is someone out there keeping an eye on for the good of, keeping the good of the community and as a focus. And I hope that's true.
Sheila?